Hi, Smart News. Hope you're having a great Monday so far. We just have a few stories to put on your radar as you start a brand new week. One about politics, the other about the pandemic, and then a kicker about a kicker. A kicker is usually a story you put at the end of the broadcast. It's supposed to be sort of lighthearted and fun. I don't know exactly where it got the name. It's just supposed to kick you off to your next thing. I don't really know, but this is actually a good story about an actual kicker. So it'll check two boxes. All right, let's tell you what's happening on Capitol Hill, because you're going to hear a lot about this over the next several days. You have Congress really taking up a major funding bill, actually several bills. One is an infrastructure bill that you've likely heard about that's more in the category of stimulus bill, about $1 trillion bill. And then you have this massive, what's described as a social spending bill. This is going to keep the government up and running. And this is a bill that's worth approximately $3.5 trillion over the course of several years. Now, Democrats have the majority in the House and then in the Senate and in the White House. And in theory, they should be able to get a bill together amongst their friends and pass this funding bill, at least these two funding bills. There's bipartisan support for the infrastructure bill, or there has been in the past, but this larger funding bill doesn't have a majority of support, at least at this time. They don't have the numbers yet. And that's what's important to know. On Thursday night, at 11:59, when the clock strikes midnight, it's sort of like Cinderella. Government funding runs out. And in fact, federal agencies have been put on alert that the government could potentially shut down. I want to be really careful about that because a lot can happen in the next several days, but these are the stakes of this week. This is why you're going to hear a lot about this. And you have these two really large spending bills that have to get from point A to point B. Now, there's the political question about whether or not Democrats are going to be able to garner the support. There's the logistic question about whether or not legislation can move as quickly as this. And then there's more of a philosophical question about whether or not these bills are the right bills for the country at this time. Republicans would say no, Democrats would say yes. Here's something I want to point out to you right now. This is from a good friend of mine, Chad Pergram, an amazing journalist who's worked on Capitol Hill for years and years and years. You can follow him on Twitter. I'm trying to get him on Instagram, but he's someone to Google if you're looking at really what's happening here, what's the historical perspective. And he pointed this out, and I think this is really important to remember. The funding bill that's really the one that would keep the government open is 2,400 pages. How many people do you think have read this bill from beginning to end? And I'm talking about everybody, lawmakers to journalists like me. And I hate to tell you this, but I haven't read all 2,400 pages. One of the reasons for that is that the bill could change dramatically. Towards the end. And so it's hard to invest that time, but it's hard to invest that time at all. And so this is a huge, huge bill that has a lot of pages and a big question about who's reading it from beginning to end. And that's why there's questions about what's tucked inside it. So this is important to watch. It's a big story from Capitol Hill this week, and I want to make sure you know what's going on. Second story to know has to do with the pandemic. You've heard about this treatment, monoclonal antibodies, right? This is a therapeutic you give to somebody when they test positive for the virus that causes COVID-19. At the very beginning of their illness, this has been shown that if you give it to them through an IV, which is the way it's mostly given at this time, it can cut the severity of the illness. We've talked a lot about this because doctors like Dr. Rutland, a pulmonologist, critical care doctor who's joined us, said this is a really important therapeutic. It has emergency use authorization in America right now for a certain group of people, usually those that are a little bit older or who have a higher risk of illness. And there's really a question about whether or not it should be available to more people. And that's why I wanted to point out this news to you. The World Health Organization over the last several days actually recommended it as a therapeutic. This is important because the World Health Organization, in its recommendations, the therapeutic has a very limited list, less than 10 recommendations. And some of those recommendations are about what not to use. So the fact that they added in the monoclonal antibodies is something that they would recommend is significant. Why it's significant further is because it just shows the big picture is this growing consensus that this is a treatment that we should pay attention to. On our website, I included an article looking at health officials from Hawaii and Idaho, drastically different parts of the country that are talking about the benefits of this treatment. So, number one, it's a treatment that you should be aware of. Number two, you should know that there's a growing consensus behind it. And number three is the question that I'm going to pose and I'm going to be looking into this week. There's been a question about whether or not it could be used prophylactically. So could you give it to someone going into, let's say, flu season or someone in a high-risk category and give them that extra boost of antibodies that would help them fight off the virus that causes COVID-19? Could you do that in communities that have low vaccination rates. On that particular topic, there's been a little bit of a controversy about this treatment because the federal government recently took control of supply. So in the past, let's say a state like Florida could reach out to the government distributor and say, we'd like a certain amount of supply for our state. Now the federal government has control. They're distributing to states. And the federal government under the Biden administration says, well, we're doing this because we want to make sure everybody has access to this treatment. Well, there are some that have been really using this treatment and somewhat promoting it, like in the state of Florida, that you see high rates of COVID-19 and maybe are offering a more diverse conversation about the treatment for COVID-19 other than the vaccines, right? There's been a real focus on vaccines. You have some in leadership that say, hey, listen, we can focus on the vaccines, but we should also focus on these treatments. And so there's some allegations of politics at play. Did the federal government take control over this because a lot of the states using the monoclonal antibody treatments were those with Republican administrations? That's a debate that's ongoing. I don't have an answer for that, but it's an interesting story that I'm going to be looking into, especially because we're seeing, again, more of a momentum towards using this treatment and a question about whether or not more people should have access to it. I think it's really important, really important. All right, final story. Just want to show this to you real quick. This is the kicker. This kicker was able to set an NFL record just last night, 66 yards, longest field goal in NFL history. What's important to know is not only that, he's the most accurate kicker in the NFL right now. But at the beginning of this game, he missed his first ever indoor field goal in his entire career. So he started off the game, kind of at a low point, finished the game at a high point with a record. And so I thought that was kind of a good lesson for us this week. You never know how the week's going to start. Anything can happen. You miss a field goal, set a record. Just a little perspective to keep in mind. All right, questions and comments, let me know. As always, all of these stories are on smarternews.com, and I'm going to be checking out that monoclonal antibody story as well, kind of figuring out what's going on there. So what stories would you like us to look at? Let us know, and always more on smarternews.com. Have a great week, guys.